On December 11, 1944, deep within the Eagle's Nest field, Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt found himself pressed against a cold concrete wall with his hands raised in surrender. Standing beside him were Field Marshal Walter Model and General Hasso von Manteuffel, his peers in command. These three men, the most formidable military minds on the Western Front, were being subjected to a degrading ritual by the SS. They were stripped of their sidearms and frisked like common street thugs, while their personal briefcases were violently torn apart and scrutinized. The atmosphere in the room was thick with unspoken rage. As scions of the old Prussian aristocracy, these officers held their dignity more dear than life itself. Yet there they stood, enduring the humiliation of being manhandled by mere political enforcers. Further inside the bunker, a trembling Adolf Hitler unveiled his grand strategy. Operation Watch on the Rhine, better known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. The plan called for 200,000 German troops to smash through the Ardennes forest and seize the vital port of Antwerp. Hitler promised them that triumph was inevitable, dismissing the Americans as mere cowboys and playboys who would panic at the first sign of trouble. He insisted they would scatter and flee just as they had during the disaster at Kasserine Pass 2 years prior. General von Manteuffel remained silent, though he did not share his leader's optimism. Having faced the Americans in combat, he knew they were far from fragile. However, the German High Command had made another critical miscalculation regarding their enemy. This error would remain obscured for decades, hidden behind a narrative carefully crafted by the German generals themselves in the aftermath of the war. In their memoirs and post-war interviews, they insisted that General George Patton was the adversary they had dreaded from the very beginning. They claimed to have monitored his every maneuver, tracing his path from the sands of North Africa to the beaches of Normandy. They painted him as the singular figure who haunted their nightmares, a compelling tale that stroked American egos while salvaging German pride. Yet when historians finally examined the actual intelligence logs from 1944, the paperwork filed while the war was still raging, they uncovered a startling truth. The dossiers were entirely blank. In February 1944, 4 months prior to D-Day, German intelligence had compiled comprehensive profiles on every key Allied leader slated for the invasion. The list included Dwight D. Eisenhower, Bernard Montgomery, and Omar Bradley. Bradley's file was detailed and Montgomery's was exhaustive, yet a file for Patton was non-existent. There was no obsession to be found. There was no fear. In fact, until August 1944, he was scarcely mentioned at all. The German brass had not been tracking Patton. They had been utterly disregarding him. How then did the ignored man become the legendary bogeyman? And if their eyes were not fixed on Patton, upon whom were they actually focused? The answers emerged from post-war debriefings conducted by American Army historians and the renowned British military theorist B.H. Liddell Hart. For years, they questioned incarcerated German generals regarding their true evaluations of the Allied leadership. The insights those officers provided were far more nuanced than the myths they had publicly peddled. Notably, only one Allied commander provoked genuine scorn. That man was Mark Clark, commander of the Fifth Army in Italy. Tall and telegenic Clark was consumed by his public image, employing a personal public relations team and arranging photographers to catch his most flattering angles. He was convinced of his own destiny, a sentiment not shared by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who led the opposing German forces in Italy. Following the conflict, Kesselring offered an appraisal of Clark that dripped with thinly veiled contempt. He explained to his interrogators that Clark was easy to anticipate precisely because of his vanity. He would invariably select the course of action that garnered the boldest headlines. Strategic necessity always took a backseat to publicity, a fact proven undeniably at Anzio in May 1944. Clark's troops had successfully breached the beachhead, leaving the German 10th Army retreating northward, exposed and defenseless. Clark possessed the opportunity to encircle and annihilate an entire German army, yet he chose instead to pivot his forces toward Rome. His desire was to be crowned the liberator of the First Axis capital, craving the photographs, the front-page stories, and the personal glory. Consequently, he allowed the German 10th Army to slip away and fight another day, a decision that carried a devastating price. While Clark was busy posing for pictures at the Colosseum, American infantrymen were still perishing in the mud of northern Italy. They were battling the very units Clark had failed to capture, paying for those beautiful photographs with their own blood. General Siegfried Westphal Kesselring's chief of staff regarded Clark as one of the greatest strategic assets the Germans possessed in the Italian theatre. This was not due to his military prowess, but because his ego rendered him entirely predictable. When one understood that Clark prioritized fame over victory, his every move became transparent. If Clark was predictable due to vanity, Bernard Montgomery was predictable due to his excessive caution. He commanded the British 21st Army Group. Having vanquished Rommel at El Alamein, he stood as Britain's preeminent military hero. Yet the German generals felt they could set their watches by his maneuvers. Von Rundstedt's assessment was cold and clinical, noting that Montgomery was overly systematic. He declared that he would never launch an offensive until he had amassed a truly overwhelming juggernaut. This philosophy proved effective, provided one possessed unlimited resources and infinite time. However, this strategy also meant that he effectively telegraphed his punches, ensuring the German command always knew precisely when the hammer was about to fall. General Gunther Blumenritt Rundstedt's chief of staff vividly pantomimed Montgomery's methodical style during his post-war interrogation. He rose from his chair and traversed the room with slow, measured paces, deliberately placing one foot continuously in front of the other. No sudden gestures, absolutely zero gambling. That Blumenritt explained was the essence of Montgomery's movement. They had decoded his algorithm. He demanded a minimum advantage of at least 2-1 in manpower and 4-1 in armor. They understood he would soften the battlefield with artillery barrages for days prior to any advance. They knew he would halt at dusk to secure his position rather than pressing the advantage. This caution rendered him vulnerable not to brute strength but to superior velocity. If you could maneuver your units more rapidly than Montgomery could stage his, you remained perpetually one move ahead on the chessboard. Operation Market Garden stood as the solitary instance where Montgomery discarded his trademark prudence. He wagered everything on a daring airborne strike to seize bridges spanning the Rhine. It was bold. It was aggressive. It was the antithesis of Montgomery's usual character. It was also a calamitous disaster costing 17,000 Allied casualties. The German defenders decimated the British 1st Airborne Division. For the Allied paratroopers stranded at Arnhem, it was a moment of bitter irony. It unfolded as a waking nightmare. They had been dropped a bridge too far, sacrificed to the vanity of a cautious general attempting to prove he possessed the heart of a lion. The German High Command did not miss the irony of the situation. The single occasion Montgomery attempted to emulate Patton, he demonstrated precisely why he should have remained conservative. Yet not every British commander garnered such German scorn. Harold Alexander led the 15th Army Group in Italy. Though technically Montgomery's superior in the Mediterranean theatre, their styles diverged sharply. Where Montgomery was rigid, Alexander was fluid. Where Montgomery demanded absolute control, Alexander facilitated. Kesselring held Alexander in high esteem, genuinely regarding him as a gentleman, a term he employed as the ultimate professional accolade. Alexander commanded what Kesselring characterized as a mongrel army. It was a mosaic of Americans, British Canadians, Free French Poles, Indians, Brazilians, and New Zealanders, scores of nationalities with distinct gear, conflicting doctrines, and disparate tongues. Knitting them into a cohesive unit required a level of diplomacy that was entirely foreign to Montgomery. Kesselring observed that Alexander possessed an innate grasp of coalition warfare. He refrained from insisting everyone fight according to his specific rulebook. Instead, he orchestrated the unique strengths of each force while smoothing over the inevitable friction between allies. This adaptability made Alexander significantly more enigmatic and harder to predict than Montgomery. He was not married to a singular tactical dogma. He evolved with the shifting tides of battle, empowering his subordinate commanders to exercise their own initiative. In the eyes of German generals, Alexander represented the commander Montgomery might have become had he possessed a shred of humility. He was a British leader who commanded respect through adaptability rather than demanding it through hubris. This distinction was pointed in German evaluations. When interrogators probed about British leadership, German generals invariably lauded Alexander while disparaging Montgomery. It was a remarkable anomaly amidst the savagery of the Second World War. A fleeting moment where adversaries gazed across the trenches and recognized a reflection of their own code of honor. They sought to destroy Alexander's army, yet they would readily salute the man guiding it. The implication was unmistakable. Germany's foes were not viewed as a monolithic block of good or evil. Certain Allied commanders merited authentic professional reverence. Others fell short. Dwight Eisenhower served as the supreme Allied commander. Although he wielded more military might than any general in recorded history, the German High Command scarcely regarded him as a general in the traditional sense. Rundstedt's appraisal was biting. To him, Eisenhower was a coordinator, not a battlefield commander, a political figure managing a partnership rather than a soldier who comprehended the art of war. German generals acknowledged that maintaining the integrity of the Allied coalition was a genuinely Herculean task. The Americans and British held diverging strategic ambitions, while the Free French forces introduced their own political complexities. Synchronizing air, land, and naval operations across multiple theaters demanded a genius for organization. Eisenhower possessed that administrative brilliance. What he lacked in the German view was the predator's instinct. Von Manteuffel told interrogators that Eisenhower's adherence to the broad front strategy was fundamentally flawed. Rather than focusing overwhelming power at a decisive point, Eisenhower pushed forward across the entire line simultaneously. This approach denied the Allies a critical war-ending breakthrough. Rundstedt concurred, asserting that the optimal Allied strategy would have been to concentrate a potent strike force and punch through past Aachen to the Rohr. Such a rupture would have shredded the fragile German front to pieces and likely concluded the war in the autumn of 1944. Instead, Eisenhower diluted his strength. He kept the entire line moving and pacified his allies. But in doing so, he gifted Germany another 6 months to fight. German High Command interpreted this as evidence that Eisenhower operated more like a diplomat in uniform than a frontline warrior. He seemed incapable of showing preference among his lieutenants, unwilling to grasp that martial efficacy occasionally necessitates administrative discord. Like a chairman presiding over a fractious board, he maintained cohesion, but refrained from striking the decisive fatal blow. Omar Bradley stood at the helm of the massive 12th Army Group, guiding a force that exceeded 1 million personnel, the largest American contingent in the European theatre. Clear-throat German leadership struggled to evaluate him precisely because he remained so elusive and understated. Unlike Clark, he shunned the spotlight. Unlike Patton, he avoided theatrical eccentricities. And unlike Montgomery, he never clamored for center stage. He merely led. Rundstedt characterized Bradley as capable and systematic. Such words from a Prussian field marshal constitute significant, albeit understated acclaim, painting Bradley as a consummate and dependable professional. He embodied the quintessential American commander, presenting a threat distinct from Patton's flamboyance, but no less formidable. Clear's throat. While he avoided reckless gambles, he also eschewed errors, preferring to exert constant crushing pressure until the enemy lines inevitably fractured. Enemy strategists observed that Bradley's approach mirrored the sheer magnitude of American industrial might. Brilliance was unnecessary when one possessed limitless assets. His role was simply to deploy that abundance effectively and avoid disastrous missteps. He executed this duty flawlessly, from the breakthrough at Saint-Lô and the sweep across France to the countermeasure against the Bulge. Every campaign was handled with professional competence and resulted in victory. Yet the Wehrmacht did not dread Bradley with the same intensity they reserved for his peers. They accorded him professional respect without lying awake at night trembling at his name. Courtney Hodges led the First Army, engaging more enemy troops than perhaps any other Allied leader. Yet most adversaries could barely recall his identity, a paradox of American strength, where German generals battled the First Army for years without knowing its master. They suffered heavy casualties against it in Normandy, crumbled before it at Aachen, and perished facing it in the Hürtgen forest. However, when questioned specifically about Hodges, captive officers found themselves at a loss for words. What remained in their memory was the force itself. Von Manteufel's description was revealing, likening the American advance to a relentless, impersonal, and unstoppable machine. The system eclipsed the individual, with the First Army possessing what seemed like an inexhaustible supply of munitions. They enjoyed total dominance of the skies and an endless stream of reinforcements, fresh soldiers, new tanks, and replacements for every loss. If a unit was annihilated, another instantly materialized to fill the void. For years, German strategists had analyzed opposing leaders, searching for personal flaws to leverage. Against such a mechanized juggernaut, human frailty was irrelevant. Clear's throat. One cannot dismantle a factory simply by eliminating its supervisors. This understanding cast a unique shadow of hopelessness over the German front. A man, after all, can be outwitted. A general can be deceived, but one cannot outmaneuver a tidal wave of steel. Engaging the First Army felt less like a contest of strategy and more like an inevitability. It resembled an execution carried out by artillery fire, a prospect far more terrifying than any solitary commander, even one as dangerous as Patton. Montgomery might have been predictable, but the American industrial engine was inescapable. Hodges was capable, if unexciting. Yet this apparatus demanded effective administration rather than genius. The enemy learned to dread a nameless force, and then there was Patton. Prior to D-Day, German intelligence had disregarded him entirely, failing to track his movements or build a profile assuming the slapping incident had permanently sidelined him. Snorts. By August 1944, they would realize the magnitude of their error. Patton's Third Army burst forth from Normandy, traversing 400 miles in merely 2 weeks, leaving German commanders in disbelief at the reports. Such velocity was unheard of. Their strategic maps became outdated within hours of creation, causing Rundstedt to instantly revise his opinion. In post-war interrogations, he confessed to his captors that Patton was their finest commander, not merely among the elite, but the absolute best. Jodl even likened him to Guderian, the progenitor of German armoured warfare. Patton favoured bold, sweeping manoeuvres, thinking in terms of grand operational strategy rather than the slow grind of tactical attrition. Kesselring remarked that Patton had elevated tank warfare to an art form, drawing comparisons to Rommel. From a leader who had faced both antagonists, this was the ultimate accolade. Bayerlein, a veteran of Rommel's African campaign, provided the most insightful comment. Whereas other Allied leaders might allow encircled German forces to slip away, Patton would show no such mercy. Bayerlein noted his conviction that Patton would never permit an easy escape. The Battle of the Bulge fundamentally altered their perception, as German planners had estimated a 2-week delay for any American response to the Ardennes offensive. Instead, Patton pivoted 3 divisions 90 degrees and launched his counterattack within 48 hours. Von Manteuffel received the intelligence and could barely grasp the reality a full army had marched 100 miles through severe winter tempests in just 2 days. Envision the sheer consternation sweeping through the German high command. Their topographical charts promised security, while their logistical calculations assured them of a reprieve. Yet piercing the veil of winter mist and heavy snowfall, the thunderous mechanical symphony of thousands of Sherman engines erupted in a space destined for quietude. This was far more than a mere tactical pivot. It was a seismic jolt to their strategic foundation. From that moment forward, the Wehrmacht leadership ceased to view General Patton with anything less than grave seriousness. They had learned a harsh lesson regarding the folly of presuming a true gladiator to be merely another rank-and-file soldier. However, General Patton was not the sole American figure to instill dread within the German officer corps. Lucian Truscott may never have ascended to the same heights of public renown. He never directed an entire army group, nor did his likeness grace the covers of glossy periodicals or the silver screens of Hollywood. Yet the German generals stationed in Italy held him in a regard of terror surpassed only by Patton himself. General Truscott assumed control of the 6th Corps at Anzio during February of 1944. Under General John Lucas, the beachhead had languished in stagnation for weeks. The German commanders had successfully corralled the landing force and were methodically eroding American strength. A mere few days after Truscott assumed command, General Westphal observed a distinct shift in the atmosphere. He relayed to Field Marshal Kesselring that American operations had suddenly acquired a new rigidity and resolve. Units previously characterized by passivity were now displaying marked aggression. Positions that had once been static were now actively probing the lines. The variables remained constant save for the arrival of a new commander. General Truscott adhered to a rigorous marching standard colloquially known as the Truscott Trot. His regiments were drilled to traverse ground at a velocity far exceeding standard military doctrine. They launched assaults well before defenders could prepare, exploiting vulnerabilities before the opposition could formulate a reaction. It was a punishing tempo that blistered feet and tested the limits of human endurance. Yet Truscott drove them relentlessly, for he was intimately acquainted with the grim calculus of warfare. Perspiration spares bloodshed. If one maneuvers with greater celerity than the enemy can process, victory is assured. To languish is to invite demise. The German command recognized this approach as nothing less than genuine tactical brilliance. Truscott remained obscure because he shunned the limelight, yet he was perilous precisely because he grasped the nuances of mobile warfare with a depth comparable to Patton. Following the cessation of hostilities when German generals enumerated the Allied commanders who had truly deeply concerned them, Truscott's name was inscribed right alongside that of Patton. It was not Montgomery, nor Bradley, nor Clark who held that distinction. The professionals recognized one of their own, and Truscott was the concealed blade that the general public never learned to dread. The German High Command evaluated Allied leadership based on a singular, uncomplicated criterion. Who among the enemy deprived them of sleep, General Clark afforded them tactical opportunities. Field Marshal Montgomery granted them precious time. Eisenhower inadvertently gifted them an additional 6 months of conflict. Bradley and Hodges offered a methodical, grinding demise from which there was no escape. Field Marshal Alexander commanded their professional respect. Truscott commanded their fear. General Patton, however, commanded both. These assessments were not concerned with moral character or leadership style, but rather with who posed the most lethal threat. By that metric, the German generals were unequivocal. Velocity was lethal, aggression was deadly, while predictability was the very thing that preserved their lives. Ultimately, the German hierarchy of Allied commanders reveals less about the Americans themselves and more about the qualities the Wehrmacht had forfeited. They held the old-world professionalism of Truscott and Alexander in high regard because it served as a reflection of their own former glory. Yet they trembled before the industrial machine of Hodges and the lightning velocity of Patton, for these forces unveiled the face of the future. And in that unfolding future, there remained no sanctuary for the Wehrmacht.